yourself. Tell me about your research. Give me the overview.
Okay, well, I'm Earth Dr. Reese Halter. I'm a conservation biologist. I'm a concerned citizen, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of studying nature in both the southern and northern hemispheres over the last 30 years. My research has taken me from the bottom of the ocean to the top of some of the tallest peaks on the face of the earth, and I'm curious and interested in all forms of life, whether it's in the Arctic, Antarctic, Valley Bottom, Death Valley, as a matter of fact, or Pacific Northwest rainforest. And I've written and worked with PBS and Time Warner with Dr. Reese's Planet. I've written 9 books and probably 700-800 articles for just about every broadsheet in the English-speaking world.
Well, the book that I'd like to discuss mainly today is The Incomparable Honeybee, and I was surprised to learn that not all bees are the same. In fact, not all bees even make honey.
Well, actually, there we know of at least 20,000 different kinds of bees, and there may be another 20,000 yet to be discovered. It turns out that most bees are indeed solitary. So their gig, the chick's gig, like all organisms, is to rear a few young. And a solitary bee goes about her business very quietly, collects nectar, turns that nectar into this magical rocket fuel that we know as honey. And calorically, incidentally, honey is equivalent to rocket fuel in the power and energy that it packs. And she leaves a little bit of honey, a little bit of pollen, because bees actually collect pollen, because pollen is their only source of protein, which builds young bees, their brains, and their autoimmune systems. And she packs honey and a little bit of pollen into a tiny nest with an egg that will eventually hatch and then eat its first form of food, the honey and the pollen, and begin to develop. So most bees, in fact, are solitary. There's the bumblebee, which is I like to call them the Harley Davidson of the bee world. They're 2 to 3 times bigger than the social bees that we know of as honeybees, which I'll get to in a moment. And the bumblebees are mostly annual. That means their lifespan lasts but 1 season, and they work from sun up to sundown, and they're able to work, interestingly, all the way from the Arctic Circle down into the base of the Sonoran Desert, into Forno-like temperatures. And then, Russell, there are these incredible social bees. We know them collectively as the honeybee. The honeybees came out of Africa, and they're the bee that has been conscripted that feeds 7+ billion people. Most of the food that we eat and all of the cotton that we wear are an African bee that migrated to Italy. And they're an Italian bee. They're gentle to work with, and they can live in colonies as large as 100,000. And they do it very, very effectively and efficiently. It's a woman-driven society. One queen, and she rules wonderfully. It's a selfless community. In fact, if you think about it, the honeybee hive is the perfect paradigm for the ultimate food service industry. It begins before sunup. It closes shop after sundown. There is zero unemployment. And the bees are able to change their order of operation within a matter of minutes. Now, I defy any of the listeners to show any of us in the world any other industry that can change. 100,000 workers can change all of their order of operations within minutes. The bees can.
Is that all delegated from the queen bee?
No, it's all delegated from the workers. The workers are able and there are different workers. There are scout bees that actually guard everything that goes in or out of the hive. There are forager bees who are constantly, perhaps as many as 10%, so 10,000 bees, if it's 100,000 in the colony, are constantly on the make for new nectar, new pollen, new water. Bees, like all other organisms, everything I'm ever aware of, it needs water. And fourthly, bees are constantly collecting a resin from trees, whether it's between the bark, whether it's from the buds, whether it's from some leaves, not many, and they take this resin, bring it back to the hive, mix it with some enzymes in their gut, and turn it into this awesome substance called propolis, which turns out to be an incredible glue or a caulking. But more, propolis is highly antibacterial, highly antifungal, and the latest research, incidentally, shows that propolis has the ability to take prostate cancer and not only halt it, but throw it into a remission. So, and we haven't even touched on the potent power of honey, but propolis is phenomenal.
Well, I've had my tablespoon of Manuka honey already this morning.
Oh, you're laughing, man. Manuka honey and from New Zealand,
yeah,
and Tupelo honey from southeastern America, United States, is very low on the glycemic index, meaning that people who are diabetic in America, that would be 24 million people, it's an epidemic there, as well as in Canada, are able to take honey and Manuka and Tupelo honey. So it's phenomenal.
60 calories per teaspoon. Very high.
Well, not only that, here to begin to tantalize the wonderment of this critter, because they're and everything to do with the bee is phenomenal. The next time any of us take a hearty teaspoon of honey, would you believe that that's 6,000 miles, 10,000 kilometers, that a dozen bees have spent their entire foraging life, 3 weeks, 7 days a week working, to make that one teaspoon. And flying time is 10,000 hours, 10,000 kilometers. Incidentally, the reason bees die is because they wear their bodies out. They literally work to death.
What's the purpose of the bee making the honey? It's not to serve humans.
No, the honey, the honey is their food source. So that's what gives them the kick to fly up to 12 miles away, one way from the hive to come back, so a round trip of 24 miles. But the honey is the most important, in addition to giving them food to fly. The honey is what sustains the colony over winter. So 100,000 bees probably are reduced in a beehive down to 30,000, 25,000. And not dissimilarly to the emperor penguin, what that bee colony does all winter long, they put the queen in the center and they shuffle and move around her concentrically using the thermal heat of the mass to keep her warm. And they shuffle just like the male emperor penguins who waddle in a circle all winter long while it's dark in like minus 65 degree temperatures with a wind. They share the inner eventually goes to the outer and so on and so forth, so that they all share in that thermal mass. Of course, for the bees, the queen will always remain in the middle. And the only thing that sustains them, in addition to their thermal en masse heat, is they all have to eat a little bit of honey. And incidentally, where we are upside down, which we'll get into later on in the show, is what human beings are feeding bees, because it isn't honey.
Aspartame?
No, public corn syrup. And as I say, we'll get into that because it turns out the corn syrup is spiked. So yeah, I think that step one, Russell, for all of us to go back to the first principles of why it's so pleasant in a warm day to sit underneath a big old tree in its shade, so much cooler, and look at things. It boils down to the wonder. And I find that if you know a little bit about things, it really enhances that wonderment. And it turns out that the bees, all bees, are not that dissimilar to human beings. I mean, we like to dance. Bees love to dance. We love to travel. Bees love to travel. We love to sleep. Bees love to sleep. We like to vote, and bees, in fact, vote. And we we like caffeine. Bees like caffeine. Some people, unfortunately, like cocaine. Bees like cocaine. I mean, I'm telling you, these critters are not that dissimilar at a basic level to us. And here's the thing. As the bee ages, it loses its memory. As people age, we lose our memory. And recently, it was shown that when an older honeybee was reintroduced to the hive, because as the bee ages, as I alluded to earlier, they go from doing all sorts of very interesting tasks within the hive, including taking care of the queen, including rearing the young newborns, cleaning the new cell, cleaning the cell, making honeycomb, and also bees are fastidious and they roam around the hive, as many as 5% of them, on cleanup duty all of the time. And then they graduate to go outside of the nest and bring in nectar and bring in pollen and bring in water and bring in tree resin to turn into propolis. But when we've seen when we reintroduce the older bee back into the hive to do some of the other tasks, it turns out that their memory becomes a lot clearer and sharper. Now, where I'm going with this is that when we, as people, as we begin to age, we know that if we do certain nimble things with our mind, crossword puzzles, a little bit of math, a little bit of reading, listening to perhaps music that symphonic music that really requires the brain to concentrate a little bit more as opposed to being white noise. They're showing that elderly people can, stave off losing their cognitive capacity by doing things a little bit differently. So the bees are very central into understanding at a basic level life and how we can age more gracefully. Of course, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, anti-aging, and it turns out that a part of anti-aging not only is eating honey, but also eating something that we call royal jelly. And royal jelly is the pollen that's collected from all different kinds of plants, brought back to the hive and mixed in with enzymes within the bee to make a protein called vitellogen, which, if you, in order to become a queen bee, they never eat honey throughout their 25 development days. They're only fed pure vitellogen, which we know as royal jelly. So royal jelly is phenomenal, and we know that is a very important anti-aging product.
You know, the other thing with the bees, perfect government. Adam Smith used the hive as a model for the perfect society.
Yeah, no, it's selfless. We know later on, I'm sure there'll be a few, or perhaps a few more questions on colony collapse disorder, what's going on in the bee world. But one thing we can tell you is that when a bee, which is the honeybee, which is very social, when they do get sick, Russell, it's hardwired into their brain not ever to return to the hive and infect their sisters, the sister workers, because all bees, turns out in the hive, 98+% of the bee population in the hive are females. The adage of a deadbeat, as applied to a male, definitely came from male bees. Male bees are deadbeats. They can't even feed themselves. Their only gig, if they're somewhat fortunate, is to inseminate a nuptial queen once in a season, usually, and that lasts for 3 seconds if they are fortunate to catch a whiff of her and copulate for 3 seconds, and then the queen pulls away. The male's appendage is inside the queen, and the male falls to the earth and writhes in pure pain until they die. That's if you win the lottery and you're a male bee. If you don't win the lottery, you live for 3 weeks. You beg because you can't fend for yourself for any food, and then you die.
What's the difference? What's the distinction between a hornet, a wasp, and a bee? And what came first?
Well, basically, in the pecking order of pollination, the bee is, when nature finds something and refines it, Russell, to the umpteenth degree, there's no sense in tinkering any further. And the main role of the bee, of course, is to pollinate. And, for the listeners, currently there are at least 235,000 different flowering plants on Earth. And bees are responsible for at least 80% of cross-pollinating those plants. So when they go in and they take a little bit of nectar to turn into honey, and they perhaps take a little bit of the pollen to turn into protein for their young, they inadvertently brush up and electrostatically attract pollen when they go to the next flower, of course, and do the same thing. That's what we call cross-pollination, and that's uber important. So the bee is the ultimate synthesis of that. The hornet and the wasp they kind of got a bad rap, and they are more irascible for sure. They are oddly enough, in science we call them beneficial insects, because both hornets and wasps knock down large pest populations that would otherwise harm or destroy our crops and our trees. So they're necessary. They're not as cool, they're not as sophisticated, and they don't dance. I mean, the honeybee dance, for the listeners going to get their minds around it, honeybees, ladies and gentlemen, communicate. And it's not just a yay or a nay. These creatures are very, very sophisticated, and they are able, when they come back to the hive in the darkness on a vertical face, not a horizontal face, they are able to, they have a short dance. The main dance we know is the Waggle Dance, a figure 8, and it consists of running, and it consists of stopping and waggling their backside and emitting chemicals, because of course it's purely dark. And what the bees are telling each other is where a new nectar patch or water or tree resin or pollen patch is, and it is based on the angle of the sun to the exact location from the distance from the hive. It's very mathematical, and it's cloudy. They are able to detect with an extra eye on the top, small eye on the top of their head, ultraviolet radiation. And they also are able to use the moon on the night of a full moon, as the end of the day is winding down, to help communicate locations. It took Carl von Fritsch probably the better part of 45 years, and in the early 1970s, this wonderful German scientist was awarded a Nobel Prize for deciphering that honeybees have a very complex language. So, I think that the wonderful thing about nature, and let's face it, you gotta be humble. You gotta understand that this is an entity, that everything on the game board, in a forest, in a desert, in your back garden, everything has a purpose. everything is refined. Forget unemployment. Forget if you can't earn your keep, you are not there. If an animal, slight digression, if an animal gets a wound or a cut, end game. There isn't an ambulance service. There isn't free health care. So everything is exact. And to be aware of this and to be in awe of it, I think lifts us to a higher vibration and an appreciation that it isn't all about human beings. It's all about the magic that's all around us. And yes, there are products and services that we get directly. I mean, the honeybees provide over 2 billion pounds of honey every year, 44 million pounds of beeswax. And incidentally, the biggest consumer of beeswax is the Roman Catholic Church. Half of their candles are made of beeswax. And so the products, and of course, cotton. Who amongst the listeners does not wear cotton? Probably pretty close to 100%.
But these products, we're not hurting the bees by using these products, right?
We're not hurting the bees, but we are conscripting the bees to the one species out of 20,000 that we know, the Italian honeybee, is the Clydesdale of our planet. And let's be very candid. The bees are trying to tell us something very clearly, Russell, that the way we are operating en masse, Homo sapiens sapiens, that's us, ain't going to work. Isn't working. We've lost 250 billion honeybees have died prematurely in the last 4 years. We call this colony collapse disorder. It's a combination of a number of factors. Climate change is very high on the list. I mean, plants are flowering weeks and sometimes months early, and the listeners are going to go, oh no, this guy's going to go off on this. Not another.
Yeah, bleeding heart liberal. What is going on?
Well, no. I'm a realist, and we can tell in the state of Maryland. Once upon a time, the honey was a very rich and red from the vegetation that was of the day in the springtime. Now it's completely of a different species. The honey locust and the black locust have moved in. The tulip tree, once upon a time was the mainstay, but the tulip trees are flowering 6 weeks earlier than they used to. So the bees have gone straight to what's flowering of the day, which are the locusts, which is clear and light. And we know, unfortunately, some of the Rocky Mountain bumblebees are awakening 2 and 3 weeks after the beautiful sun-colored glacier lilies have sprung up and done their dance. And the bumblebees are not there to cross-pollinate. They're still on the old mountain time, not on the new climate change time, and so they're missing out. And we call this a climate-driven mismatch, and it's very, very serious. But the way we're treating bees, we think of, listeners may think of an apiarist, a honeybee farmer, as somebody who makes honey. Not true. A bee farmer's business is the business of pollination. That's right. What they do. Yep. They offer their services, their hives, and they move their hives from A to B to C and so on and so forth.
I grew up in the prairies. And,
well, there you know.
And that's the thing. If you could get a guy to bring his bees to your field, bonus.
Right. And they make honey. You see, here's how we help connect the dots. So the bees are dying. What does that mean for the farmer? Well, that means, just like many of us, it means their costs are going up. They've got to buy new queens. They've got to go out. They've got to grow new colonies. And that costs them money. So one way they're trying to recover on that is they're feeding the honeybees corn syrup, which has got a sugar, but it's not honey. And they take the honey that the bees make and they sell it at market. And that might be, that is what it is. But here's where we're in peckle of trouble. And I mean a peckle of trouble. Scientists, bless their cotton socks, working in a closed environment. What we do when we're trying to protect our crops, for instance, whether it's corn or tomatoes or whatever it is, but let's stick with corn. We have invented the chemists have made some very sophisticated chemicals that are designed to knock down a couple or maybe a half dozen what we call agricultural pests, and they're labeled the target species. And so they cleverly invented a group of chemicals called neonicotinoids. And the neonicotinoids are what we call the next generation of chemicals that are not sprayed. They're not crop dusted, sprayed on the fields. As a matter of fact, every seed is dunked in this poison and coated with a fine talcum powder, like a product, talc. And when the seed is planted, these clouds of white talc spread into the soil and the air and the water. And that's another problem because that's toxifying the water and it's killing the soil. Russell, the most important thing in agriculture, don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise, is the soil. If you hammer your soil, if you beat up your soil, you are, that is anything but sustainable. And these neonicotinoids...
You can be as organic as you want, but if your soil has no nutrition in it or is toxic,
you're done. And so these neonicotinoids are killing the soil and hanging around in the soil for up to a decade. But let's go back to the plant. So the corn seed is covered in this neonicotinoid, and it grows. As it germinates and the plant grows to maturity, it moves these chemicals, target chemicals, into either the corn pollen or the corn nectar. Now, it is true, corn is a wind-pollinated plant, so it doesn't need the bees at all. It's nada. But the bees, when they're out foraging in the fields, if they come across a cornfield, you bet they'll take the nectar back to the hive to make honey, and they'll take the pollen back to the hive to mix it with honey into what we call bee bread and feed the young. It turns out that the neonicotinoids are, the residual poisons are highly lethal to bees. And what happens to the bees is they lose their memory and they wind up, they can't find their way home to the hive, and they also shake to death. They're likened both to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. And we know this. They have been banned in a couple European countries. There have been some, there is a current injunction in place in New York State because it turns out that the company that's responsible for this had a flawed design when they presented it to the EPA. They're in question. But the point is that neonicotinoids en masse are being used in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, in Mexico, and many, many other countries. And they really, truly need to be taken off the market because they're known to kill honeybees. Now, we're not even talking about bumblebees. We know that there's been a couple studies in Europe and elsewhere that have shown that neonicotinoids are lethal for bumblebees. But here again, we have such a limited data set on all the wild solitary bees and bumblebee populations. We don't really know much about bumblebees per se, and so we don't even have any data on that. And of course, there are viruses. There is a terrible varroa mite, a little mite that gets inside the bee's windpipe, the tracheid, and chokes them to death. And the varroas are plaguing planet Earth. The only continent that they have yet to impregnate is Australia, and Australia is on uber guard as New Zealand has varroas, and that's a problem. Australia does supply a lot of queen honeybees around the world, and there are bacteria. There are dozens of diseases. Many are global because of the food products and how we jet food all around the world. And so we have to be on guard. In the United States, in order to feed 300 million people, there's approximately 2.4 million commercial honeybee hives, and they're constantly trucked all over America on the 18-wheelers. They start in the south in the spring, and they work their way, many of them overwinter, into the central California, the San Joaquin, and the Sacramento Valley, because there, it turns out, there's the biggest bee orgy on the face of the earth. That would be in the almond plantations. It's a couple $billion crop, and it requires almost 85% of all the commercial hives need to congregate in February for about 3 weeks to cross-pollinate these almonds. And many fear and feel, rightfully so, that they're actually swapping diseases. So it's a heck of a ride, but I gotta say that without the honeybee, life as we know it, going to the supermarket, and more than that, life as we know it with 7 billion people, who incidentally will be 8 billion in 12 years, wouldn't happen. I've heard scientists say, oh, well, we just have a few crops. You think a few crops are going to feed 8 billion people? Think again.
Yeah, these scientists want to make every crop on Earth corn.
Yeah, well, think again. Corn is not our friend. No.
Now, the bees in North America, are they not imported from Africa?
Well, once upon a time, yes. All the honeybees are Apis mellifera, which is the Italian honeybee. There is a movement afoot using a Russian honeybee. It's a black bee. It's a little more angry or irascible. That is showing a lot more genetic strength against many of these diseases, but they're a cold climate bee, and there's some problems awakening them and getting them to do early pollination. But by and large, they are all the Italian honeybee that is doing 95% of the pollination on the globe for food. And of course, again, I say, all of the 20,000 species of bees are helping to cross-pollinate 80+% of the 235,000 different kinds of flowering plants. That's the diversity in the Garden of Eden, aka planet Earth.
But it sounds to me like there's a shot at fixing this. If the African honeybee is not indigenous to North America, then a new bee can be introduced and revitalize the system. I've heard that the killer bee, in fact, outproduces the honeybee. It's just
it might, but there aren't a lot of social bees. I mean, there maybe are a dozen or more out of Africa colonies that can handle 100,000 and are easy to work with. The killer bee is a Hollywood myth that is really a pain in the backside. The killer bee is a failed, another human bungled experiment. They're an African bee that was taken over to Brazil to pollinate some crops. They didn't work, and the bee population, as all bees, they escaped and they started to migrate north. Now, do killer bees seek out and hunt people to sting a zillion times? Poppycock. There's the occasional stinging, of which the media is culpable for making a big deal out of it, because it is not a big deal.
It's like the piranha and the shark.
Yeah, it's like, getting stung to death by bees the probability is almost in the realm of getting hit by a bolt of lightning. Yes, a few people do. Yes. Should we fear and loathe the bee? Come on. Go walk in the inner city of any city. Come on. And that's some 19th century paradigm to fear nature and, don't go swimming because a great white shark is waiting for you. Yeah, come on.
Is there any hope to any of this? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Oh, my heavens.
There's so much hope. I mean, come on, Russell. Let's start with kids. They are tomorrow. They love nature. Well, there's no better way to marry bees and children with a couple plants. And here's the thing: in the springtime, whether you live in an apartment, a condo, or are blessed with a back garden, everybody, and I mean everybody, should be growing some tomatoes and some peppers right off the hop. The kids get to see that bumblebees are the pollinators. And we didn't talk about this, but bumblebees are such a trip because they curl their bodies, and when they come into the flower and they spin, they do a 180 or 360 very quickly, and the electrostatic of the body attracts all of the pollen. They forget brushing up about anything. They just do this curl, and they're like a puffball, and they're wonderful. And then the kids get to see them, and then, look, 6 weeks later, I get to eat. Now, look.
You say tomatoes and peppers, but not flowers?
Oh, sure, for flowers, but I was trying to bring that down to the ground. Why are they important?
Right.
And more importantly, self-gratification as a human. What do we get? What's in it for me?
I think, interestingly, though, it's not just superficial flowers that they're interested in.
No, God, no. Food, crops. And what I was going to say is that everybody with a yard, for heaven's sake, get into it. Get an apple tree, get a pear tree, get a plum tree. If you live south, get yourself citrus. This is about food security. We're coming into, and I've made light of it, but we're coming into some very serious times. And, for every problem, Russell, there are at least 3 solutions. So human beings do 2 things, basically. We're tool makers and we're problem solvers. So what's the problem? There isn't a problem. We know what's causing the problem. So look, please, audience, make a pact to yourself, to your kids, to the heavens, to me. Don't be using any herbicides, any insecticides, any miticides, or any fungicides in your garden. Don't do it, because it's going to kill the bees and the soil. Don't do it. Plant native yellow and blue flowers. What's a native yellow and blue flower? Well, it depends where you live. So the first thing I do is either get online and Google where you live and what are native flowers, or go down to the local nursery and ask. Plant those flowers in as large a block as you can, solid color, solid blue, solid yellow. Because what it does is it provides a safe nectar and pollen source for our urban bees. That's really important because there's a major resurgence, and legally so, of urban beekeeping, which, Russell, has its roots in the land of milk and honey. That bee is real. 3,000 years ago, they kept bees in inner cities. And I've been a part of the movement. I'm blessed to have helped in the Los Angeles area, city councils there, saying, yes, we welcome urban beekeepers. And let me tell you, from Chicago to Vancouver to New York to Sydney to Melbourne to Tokyo to London and Paris and all points in between, city councils are allowing urban beekeepers to keep their bees.
Have you heard what's happening in New York City? People they're carrying bees on rooftops. They're flourishing there.
And it turns out that some of the finest Epicurean restaurants, on top of their skyscrapers, they've got a hive. And come on, get with the program. And so that's very good. And so we start with not poisoning our own environment. Look, you are what you eat. And no one wants to be eating any poison. I can assure you, 1 part per million is 1 part too much per million of poison. So don't do it at home, and show your kids what it is that involve the kids. Get your hands dirty, show them the food, and there's no question whatsoever, Russell, that we all can lend a helping hand. We must lend a helping hand, and even more. So let's carry it a couple steps further. When we're talking about food, we're talking also about grocery bags. And these single-use plastic disposable bags are the enemy. We are manufacturing over 500 billion of them every year. Hundreds of millions are winding up in the ocean. You're killing life senselessly. Get yourself, every family needs to get themselves a half a dozen organic cotton reusable shopping bags. Everything is a habit. Get in the habit. Take them to the grocery store, load them up, come home, unload, take the bags back to the trunk of your car or put them on the door handle as you go out, so that get in the habit. The cotton comes from the bees, and all of a sudden we've done a bunch of great things. And if everybody changes 2 habits, Russell, that is the equivalent of every Stanley Cup ring that's ever been issued en masse. It's a win. We won.
Well, we vote with our dollar. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Purchasing power is everything. And here's the thing, Russell. The fact that climate change is such a given and very real, and it's now to climate disruption, and it is altering our food system, the price of food is going up, and irrefutably. And so now we've just got to be careful. I urge our listeners to grow their own fruit, grow their own veggies, learn how to can stuff, or pickle it for the winter, and a byproduct of that is we get to go back to our roots as people of the land, and we get to see bees, and we get to appreciate bees, and we get to spend quality time, Russell, with our families involved in making our food.
Do you feel that we're stewards of the planet, or is that arrogant?
Well, we're stewards of the planet, and yes, and we look, life is fraught with making mistakes, but for every mistake, there's a lesson to be learned. So, as I alluded to earlier in the show, we're making a mistake with using these powerful neonicotinoids that are killing the bees. Okay, so what we do? We stop using them. We made a mistake, we understand it, and we move forward. It is culpable if we knowingly are killing animals or plants using a chemical that will give an end result of death. That's not cool. It's not on. So we made a mistake, correct it, move on. Life.
Can we purchase honey products and then eliminate the corn syrup market?
Tough one. I do say that make it a family day. Google your local beekeeper, wherever you live in the nation or the world, and make it a family day to go to the bee farmer and buy his honey and buy his propolis. At least step one is we're supporting these guys. I wouldn't ever, under any circumstances, buy generic honey in any grocery store in any country of the world. China is the biggest honey producer. The Chinese are using toxic chemicals, some which have been banned in North America and Western Europe and Australia for a couple decades. I only get from a local beekeeper. If you can get it organically certified, all the better. But right now, I just go to the beekeepers. It's a fun family day. It's a way also for you to learn more about bees from experts. That'd be the beekeeper, and they need our help. So when you think about it, it just makes good sense to take time with the family and get honey. Get honey. It's just such a wonderful thing. Incidentally, teaspoon of honey for anybody who's over the age of about 5, it will give you a better sleep, and it will stimulate children's growth plates. It's a superfood, as long as you know where it comes from, which is got to be from a local beekeeper.
Well, I'm here in Vancouver, and I've been getting some stuff from Soyuz, BC.
The apple capital.
Yeah, this great dew honey, it's called.
Oof.
And I've been giving that to my 5-year-old son, a teaspoon a day. I mean, what kid is not going to like that, right?
Yeah, no. And as I say, it's known to stimulate their growth plates.
Wow.
So it's so natural. The ingredients in honey so much mimic the human blood serum that it's staggering. And we're talking minerals and nutrients. Honey is now being used on bandages in Australasia because it's a huge antiseptic, antifungal. Look, we found honey, and honey keeps, if it's sealed, for thousands of years. We've seen it from the Egyptian tombs, and make it a part of your world. You are what you eat, for heaven's sakes. And
if you ever get stung, the number one thing you do is you put a little bit of honey right there where you get stung. That's amazing. Yeah, and it turns out that the bee venom, Russell, is phenomenal. It's we call it apitherapy, and for the millions of people around the world suffering from fibromyalgia, and tens of millions suffering from arthritis, and those afflicted with multiple sclerosis, the apitherapy is offering respite, and the treatment, often a week's long worth of treatment, will last half a year for
fibromyalgia and arthritis, and safe. It's a safe product. So, I mean, my gosh, how good is that?
People want to know how a bumblebee can fly. Apparently, it's against aerodynamic theory.
Well, the bumblebee actually inspired a helicopter. A bumblebee it creates a vacuum. First of all, they've got to warm their body up to a temperature of at least 21, 22 degrees C. And the only thing that could do that if you woke up in the Arctic in the spring is honey, calorically. And they shiver. They do that 360 spin. They shiver, and in a matter of a split second or two, they are able to elevate their body temperature with the calorics of the honey. And then they create a vacuum cavity with their wonderfully strong wings that lift them up and propel them to the flowers to collect more nectar, to get more energy, to do their dance of life. And, you know, humans are inexorably linked into the dance of the honeybees. And knowing what we know empowers us to take the right steps to protect our food, our bees, our environment, our children, and our future. Because you said it the best, the humans are the stewards of our planet, and there's a lot of things that people know or that have been reported on in the media that are going wrong. So you know what? We each pick a cause and we turn it around. We do a couple habits differently. We do them better because we have children, and I don't know any responsible parent that wants to leave our planet in any worse condition than it is right now. As a matter of fact, we all want to leave it a little bit better. That is what needs to propel our species to mimic some of the selfless qualities of the honeybees, because they act for the betterment of the colony. And we need to begin to act for the betterment of our species. It's not Big Brother. It's not a free lunch. No, it's what we can do to help each other, our families and our community and our nation and globally.
I have Dr. Nick Begich on my program. You're familiar with his work.
Yeah, he's great, Dr. Nick.
The Earth's natural frequency is 7.8 hertz. You know, once again, Big Brother, the scientists, they're pushing up the ionosphere and messing with the Earth's magnetosphere. And
something called HARP. I'm sure Dr. Nick will talk about that.
Well, that's what we're talking about. You better believe it.
Also, what we do want to take good care of, certainly for our children at the very least. Everything's got to be for the kids because they are tomorrow. Our cell phones and cordless phones at home are very high frequency radiation. If you're letting your kids use them, that's one thing. Please have them use them on the microphones so they're not right next to their heads, because we do know that high frequency is hugely disruptive for the honeybee. The queen produces at least 3/4 less eggs. And also, when the bees are exposed, when the rest of the bee colony are exposed to the high frequency of a cell phone, and that's one phone, can you imagine a cell tower, but which is so much stronger, the bees get very anxious and they emit a sound that is a precursor in their world to swarming. When we see these swarms of bees, that means that half the colony is gone with the old queen to find a new location, which, by the way, the scout bees vote on. And if a quorum of 13 bees can agree on where the new nest or hive goes, then that's where they go. And they emit a frequency, which essentially is, we got to bug out of this joint, and they take the queen and they move. So when you see a ball of bees, that's just a queen in the middle, and they're looking for a new home. But the point is that cell phones and the frequency are very disruptive to the bees. And the bees have been likened to canaries in coal mines. And 100 years ago, 150 years ago, they used to take the canary down deep into the earth, and they sang in the cage. And when the noxious gases came out of the earth, when they're looking for new coal, and killed the canary, that was a good indication that people needed to get OUT out of the shafts ASAP. And the bees are dying now, and they have been likened to canaries in the coal mines. And we've got to, let's look at what's happening around us. That's incidentally what ecologist does. ecologists study patterns on the landscape. And when we see a number of patterns all starting to look pretty similar, that's good enough for me and good enough for my colleagues. And the bees are telling us that we must change. It's not a matter of, oh, well, maybe we'll get to that in a decade. No, we'll be getting to that post-haste.
Wow. So ditch the cell phones, and by God, this makes me think of the smart meter program, too.
So, we got to be aware of it. I mean, these are frequencies, and, children have not, they have autoimmune systems that have not hardened off. And my weak working hypothesis is when I grew up, I never heard of a peanut allergy, and any kid who brought peanuts to the school was welcomed into my group because we ate them. But today, kids have got allergies, and the reasons we believe are the environment is poisoned to a degree where their autoimmune systems are not able to cope and function so well. We have to be careful, for sure.